Adam Sos here for Rebel News, and I'm very fortunate now to be joined by Alan Honor of the Democracy Fund. The Democracy Fund is representing two men in a very troubling case. They've been charged under the Calgary Transit bylaw for allegedly interfering with the comfort of an unknown transit user while en route to the Million March for Children in Calgary, Alberta. This isn't the most recent one that just happened, but the one that took place back in September. Now, this is a bylaw, and I'm going to read this to make sure I get it verbatim right, that prohibits anyone on transit property from engaging in activity that would interfere with the comfort, convenience, or quiet use and enjoyment of the transit system by any reasonable person. Now, I can assure you, I've seen a lot of behavior that violates those restrictions, but the authorities don't show up within a couple minutes and arrest the people. But these two individuals have been told, they've not been told what they did to contravene the bylaw, but they had a private conversation on the C train together. Apparently, someone overheard this conversation. They thought the train was mostly empty. Apparently, that was not the case. And they were detained by enforcement upon exiting the train. So these individuals, their names have not been sort of released yet, so we're not going to get into those details. But Alan, a quick question for you. Like, public transit, it's known to be unruly and unsafe. Daniel Smith has brought in additional sheriffs to sort of help with the situation. Is this really the sort of thing, a conversation that's taking place on public transit where there's lots of issues that authorities should be investing their time into?
Well, Adam, we don't know what these people did, right?
Yeah.
And to get to your point, the bylaw that you just cited, the portion of the bylaw you just cited, talks about any activity that somebody engages in that would interfere with the comfort or convenience and so on of any reasonable person.
Yeah.
There's another part of the bylaw that comes right after that, which prohibits anyone using transit from behaving in a manner that would cause safety concerns to any reasonable person. So this part of the bylaw that my clients were charged under doesn't really have anything to do with safety.
Right.
It has something to do with comfort and
Mm-hmm.
convenience and the quiet use and enjoyment of the transit system. What that is, we don't know.
Yeah. Well, and you'd think with that following right after, there might be a bit of exegesis where they're taking the one little line and saying, someone was made uncomfortable with this. I suppose the other question that I have, and I know we don't know this information yet, but maybe I'm just thinking out loud, is I've seen melees unfold, people having drug episodes on transit for 20, 30 minutes, no one intervenes. This is purportedly, and I think this is still the case, an unknown individual somehow managed to notify authorities, and as they were exiting the train, they were already taken arrested until they were ticketed, at least, or cuffed until they were ticketed. Is that accurate? Someone managed to sort of bridge that gap to authorities responding during one train ride?
Well, we don't know, Adam. So
Yeah.
what we know is that my clients were on the C train. They were having a conversation. They were talking to another person. It was a friendly conversation. The C train wasn't filled with passengers at the time. And yes, when they got out at their stop, they were arrested or they were
Yeah.
detained by law enforcement officers.
Hmm.
So did somebody overhear their conversation and contact bylaw? How did that all fall into place? I don't know.
Yeah, there's good questions, and I'm not putting words in your mouth, but I'm wondering if someone, whether involved in the opposite side or maybe inside a certain office in government, whatever it may be, may have seen this, overheard this, and decided to make an example. It's certainly troubling. Just the thought alone that two people can be having a conversation, maybe you don't agree with them, but it seems like something from another country, not Canada, where you can be in such trouble for that. Obviously, there's restrictions in place if they're sitting there plotting violence or
Mhm.
something like that, or speaking in very egregious fashion, but that doesn't seem, at least from what we've heard, I know we don't have all the facts yet, to be the case here. And now, is it true that one of the individuals was actually handcuffed while the conversation was taking place, while their identity was being sought by authorities?
One of the individuals was handcuffed, according to
Hmm.
that individual, when he was detained by the police or by law enforcement, and that was apparently related to ascertaining his identity. I don't have all of the facts on that
Of
yet.
course.
I haven't seen the disclosure. But
Unfortunately.
Adam, what you were talking about before, um, on the C train, on the TTC, wherever you happen to be, if somebody is, fighting or swearing and causing a melee, that's there's a legal term for that. It's called causing a disturbance.
Right.
It's a crime under the criminal code. You can get into trouble for that.
Hmm.
Um, why do you need this
Yeah.
transit bylaw?
Well, and you've hit the nail on the head. I wanted to get to this, but let's get to it right now. There seems to be a lot of instances, and I mean, one of the best examples I can think of lately is this the ban on pro life imagery. It's happened in places right across the country, but a bunch of small towns right around Calgary and Calgary. There's already sort of laws in place for whether it be displaying. Horrific images, propagating hate, causing a disturbance, whatever it may be. There's already laws in place, but there seems to be sort of ideologically driven city councils bringing in bylaws that, in my opinion, probably overstep a little bit, and are often utilized to enforce perhaps personal ideologies, but not the will of the majority. Is this a problematic new development? Like, how common is it to see bylaws that sort of overstep into other jurisdictions?
Well, I think what we're seeing right now is the increased use of bylaws uh, to regulate expression.
Hmm.
And whether or not that's ideologically driven is something that, you know, you'll have to decide for yourself, Adam, and
Right.
your viewers will have to decide for themselves. But
Hmm.
if you consider that bylaw coming out of London, that's a graphic images bylaw. It prohibits the distribution of graphic images to residences in London unless certain
Yeah.
conditions are met. But the funny thing about it is that a graphic image is defined very narrowly
Yeah.
as an image of a fetus or any part of a fetus, no matter how benign. That's a graphic image. And that makes you think that this isn't really about keeping people safe. It's about restricting pro life speech. If somebody drew that conclusion, it would
Mm-hmm.
be a reasonable conclusion to draw, I think.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I know they didn't want to say overtly fetus. There's a similar law in Okotoks. So they said I think they didn't want to say human fetus, so they said mammalian fetus. So technically, like an ultrasound of a dolphin is if you deliver an ultrasound of a dolphin to somebody, it's a violation of a law. It's pretty surreal stuff. We're seeing lots of copycatting of that bylaw right across the country. Calgary, Okotoks, Strathmore, a number of other places have it. You bring up something interesting there, though, and I'm not saying that you're saying this is ideological, but we have seen a lot of selective enforcement lately, and it does seem to be protesters can gather outside of an event, and if you're protesting, say, against drag story hours, you'll get ticketed, but if you're protesting for, that's allowed. If you're gathering in large numbers, say, in a mosque during COVID-19, that seems to be okay, but Christian pastors seem to be targeted. This is a bit off topic, but these folks were of a social conservative mindset, presumably heading to the Million March for Children. At least they seem to be supporting that event, and they seem to have been singled out and targeted. Is this becoming an undeniable pattern?
I don't know about it. I don't know about all the details as much as you do, Adam. But I think that's a really big risk, right? If the bylaw or the law is being applied selectively, or even if it's perceived as being applied
Mm-hmm.
selectively, that's going to create more division in our society, right? And so many of these bylaws that have been passed have appealed to human rights. Um, and I think if you give the municipal councils the benefit of the doubt, they're trying uh, to put a stop to some of the discrimination that happens on human rights grounds. But I think they're going to make things worse if there's even a perception
Mm-hmm.
that these bylaws are being enforced in a way that's not even-handed. And I'm always reminded of one of my personal heroes. He's a former president of Czechoslovakia, Václav Havel. He wrote a book. It was called The Power of the Powerless. And he says, if somebody looked at the laws of Czechoslovakia as it was then, they'd say, these are not so bad. What is everybody complaining about? But if they knew how those laws were selectively enforced,
Right.
then they would have a much different perspective on it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happened there. And a lot of people are worried that that's what's happening here now.
Well, and there is sort of Is there a bit of irony in saying that you're doing something to advance human rights, and meanwhile you're infringing on someone's right to have a conversation in public, the freedom of assembly, all these other sort of rights we've seen trampled? Two people sitting there having a conversation, then being handcuffed because of it seems like a more serious infringement on someone's rights than someone overhearing part of a conversation not intended for them and being offended by it. Am I off base?
No, I don't think you are. And the funny thing, Adam, is that most of the bylaws, like I said, appeal to human rights to try and limit some form of speech. And maybe that's a pressing and substantial objective that would be, that the court would acknowledge as something that could override a charter right. But this
Yeah.
Calgary Transit bylaw doesn't even do that. It
No.
doesn't even appeal to human rights. It's just anything, any
Mm.
activity, which would interfere with the comfort, convenience, or use and enjoyment of the transit system.
Mm.
And to the extent that that activity includes private communications, that is very troubling.
Yeah, it's certain, and it really does feel like surreal. Like upon reading this, I know when the Democracy Fund you guys put out your release, this spread pretty rapidly, not just in Canada but around the world. That this sort of the sentiment that you can be having a conversation, and again, we're going to keep covering the story as details come out. If, as you mentioned, you have reached out to the city of Calgary, but you've really heard nothing yet. These two individuals, they haven't heard what they're actually being accused of, what the conversation was that disturbed somebody else. When those facts come out, we certainly want to bring them to people. But just at face value, this is a shocking story, isn't it? I mean, is there anything quite like this specifically in your legal precedents that you can think of that's so egregious?
Well, I don't know, Adam, because I don't know any of the details yet. We've asked for the disclosure. We don't have it. We're assuming it's a conversation, but maybe it's something else. Because
Yeah,
that bylaw is very broad. It says an activity,
right,
right? Now we're assuming that the activity is a conversation because that's what these folks were doing. They
right.
were chatting on the C train. They don't know
Yeah,
what they did.
yeah.
They don't know what they did to cause somebody offense, but it looks like that's what happened.
Wonderful. Well, Alan, I want to thank you so much for your time. It's good to have some of this insight, some of these troubling bylaws. They seem, honestly, one last question for you, if you don't mind. When did this sort of start? Like, to me, what jumps to mind is throughout COVID, when certain governments weren't willing to bring something in, we saw silly cities saying, you know what, we're going to bring in these policies. Is that sort of when this started? Or can you think of, is there much history of bylaws sort of overstepping and bringing about stories like this?
Well, it's a great question.
Hmm.
It goes back a few years, and it's one bylaw at a time, right? I
Right.
mean, Edmonton brought in their bylaw, which is sort of regulates public behavior on the transit system and in other areas. That one was recently copied by the regional municipality of Waterloo.
Hmm.
There's about a 2 year gap, I think, between those two bylaws. Before that, Calgary had their own bylaws, I believe, about restricting certain uh, 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 about restricting the delivery of flyers to mailboxes.
Right.
How far it goes back, I can't say off the cuff, but it seems like right now um, it's ramping up, and
Yeah.
it's something that we're going to see more of in the future.
Yeah, and there certainly does seem to be a lot of copycatting. I know Calgary brought it in here, then it was Strathmore, then it was Okotoks, then it was they're like, oh, we're gonna copy what the other guy's doing. Certainly, imitation and precedence in law is not a bad thing, but when it's bad law, it can become a bad thing. So, very troubling to see that evolving. We're gonna cover the story. Clearly, there's a lot of interest on it. I do want to thank the Democracy Fund for taking this on. This is just one of the many cases where people might have otherwise just had to say, "Oh, we're sorry, we can't afford lawyers to fight back the against us. We can't push back. We're going to have to bend the knee to the crown." Because of the work you're doing and because of the Democracy Fund, there's a capacity for people like this to say, hold on a second, this isn't quite right. So thank you for bringing attention to the story and for joining me. I really appreciate it. That's Alan Honor of the Democracy Fund. And as always, I want to thank you all so much for tuning in for Rebel News. I'm Adam Sos. Well, this is just one of the examples of the incredible work that the Democracy Fund does, whether it was pastors throughout COVID 19 or critical freedom of speech issues like this. The Democracy Fund is very often the last line of defense, ensuring people who otherwise would probably just have to bend the knee to the overbearing weight of government can afford exceptional legal counsel in their corner and can take a critical stand. So if you are able, please consider chipping in at thedemocracyfund.ca.